Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. We'll be getting started shortly. We're just waiting for a few more people to join. Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Neil, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Cameron. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Neil Bomberg, and I'm the Senior Policy Advisor here at the National Association of Regional Councils. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar entitled Bridging the Divide Between Urban and Rural Areas. Our speakers today, Christy McFarland, Research Director at the National League of Cities, and David Shabazian, Manager of the Sacramento Area Council of Governments RuralUrban Connections Strategy, will provide you with the opportunity to learn about the economic relationships between rural and urban communities across the nation generally and in the Sacramento area specifically, and how to bolster those relationships in your area in economically meaningful and strategic ways. Each of the presenters brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to this issue, and a knowledge of the kinds of things that can be done to bridge the urban-rural divide. Equally important, they will directly and indirectly destroy many of the myths that exist about rural areas, such as residents of rural areas are not entrepreneurial, that rural areas are overwhelmed by negative crises, such as the opioid crisis, and that urban and rural areas share little, if nothing, in common. This webinar is based on extensive research that Christy McFarland has conducted on behalf of the National League of Cities on the urban-rural divide, and the important work that David Shabazian has done in the Sacramento area to bridge the divide between the city's rural and urban areas and mitigate any negative impacts that might accrue. In fact, you're going to learn that there are significant benefits to urban areas that arise when the divide between urban and rural areas is bridged. This webinar has been designed to underscore the important ways in which rural areas contribute significantly to regional economies and the benefits that accrue. This webinar has been scheduled to coincide with the ongoing debate on Capitol Hill around reauthorization of the Farm Bill, a law that not only provides one of the most important social services available, that is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, formerly known as food stamps, but also significant support for rural development efforts. I should add, before turning this over to Christy, that Macy Morin has also joined the call from NARC staff and will be available during the Q&A to address any issues that might stem specifically from the Farm Bill itself. I would also add that there will be a recorded version of this posted on our website. You will get notice of it when it is posted in the next day or so. Once again, let me thank you for joining us today. And without further ado, let me turn the webinar over to Christy, who will begin this webinar by providing you with the broad overview reflective of her research. Christy?
Great, thank you, Neil. I believe there was going to be a poll in the front here. Let me see. Okay. All right. All right, we'll go ahead. We do have a poll that we will introduce to you shortly. If you go under polls, you'll be able to find it there, and essentially it's asking each of the participants on the webinar to identify the extent to which urban and rural areas within your region have interconnections, economic interconnections. And so far, we're at 55% of you are indicating that there are a great deal of interrelationships between urban and rural communities in your region. It's about 50-50 right now between a great deal and somewhat. No one seems to be indicating that there are no economic relationships, which I think goes to show it's more reflective of the realities on the ground as opposed to what we're hearing in the national dialogue, which is very much juxtaposing urban and rural communities from each other, isolating them from each other. But when you look at what's really happening on the ground, there are much closer relationships than at first glance. So again, thank you, Neil. Thank you, NARC. Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here with you today to present our new research on bridging the urban and rural economic divide. So at National League of Cities, I work with mayors, council members, city staff from across the country. And it really has led me in particular and National League of Cities overall to rethink the urban and rural divide. Because we know, as you know, that when issues are presented as black and white, as the urban and rural divide often is in the national context and national discussions, whether that's urban and rural in an economic context or a political context or a cultural context, we know that when we're dealing with local and regional realities, that nuance is critically important, and that when you see things that are explained in too simple of terms, that's often misleading, and that's generally tells you it's an area to dig deeper. So that really was our first impetus for really wanting to dive deeper, not only on better understanding the urban-rural divide, but putting an economic context and frame on the issue. And from our perspective, when we put an economic frame on the issue, what we get from that is not only a better understanding of the connections between urban and rural communities, but also glimpses into where can we hone economic development strategies to help bring growth not only to regions but to states overall. So we'll get a little bit more into that. But again, the goal of this research is to change how we think about urban and rural, to better reflect what you all in regions across the country are experiencing, and to get to solutions quickly. The current narrative, the national narrative on urban-rural divide is steeped in conversations, again, that isolate urban and rural areas from each other, hone in specifically on the challenges of these places, but is very slow to get to any solutions to help communities enhance their economic growth. So again, an economic frame on urban and rural divide not only helps pinpoint the economic relationships between urban and rural, but also provides glimpses into strategies that can be used to bolster these interdependencies and in the process improve overall regional and state economic growth. So with that, we'll be able to show. I just briefly, National League of Cities, I'm with the Center for City Solutions as the research director. Our team conducts research. Other parts of our organization is also focused on technical assistance directly with cities in areas like land use and equitable economic development. And we also provide leadership education to mayors and council members across the country to help them in terms of communications with constituents, to have a better handle on city budgets and so forth. Really to help bring city officials and mayors not only up to speed on the basics of governing, but to really help them take it to the next level, to really move their communities forward and to collaborate on a regional basis as well. So overview, today I'll be talking a little bit about what is the urban and rural divide, or typically how do we think about urban and rural. We'll do a little bit more of a deep dive into some of the economic divides. We examine broadband access, education, high value business formation, as well as prosperity growth. And then I will touch a little bit on bridging the divide, and that's to focus on strategies. Given that we have David on with us today, I will turn it over quickly to him since he can give you some on-the-ground perspective. So what is urban and rural? You know, from an analyst perspective, when we think about urban and rural, we see many researchers out there using the Office of Management and Budget definitions, which is either metropolitan or outside of a metropolitan area. And there's some very good reasons for why people do that, primarily because data tends to be readily available at those levels of analysis. But then when we look at the census designation of urban and rural, which is focused more on population size, density, land use, and distance to urban areas, we see that 20% of completely rural counties are actually part of metropolitan areas. So it becomes clear that there are some inconsistencies in the ways that we think about urban and rural, even from a research and data perspective. And then, of course, that gets right to the heart of being able to explain urban and rural and also ways to help bridge that divide. In this analysis, we feel that the census definition is more specific to what is happening in urban and rural places, particularly given that it's an index of both population size, density, land use, and distance to urban areas. We utilize county level as the unit of analysis. We also combine rural, mostly rural and completely rural as the rural category. So we have two categories, rural and urban. And all counties are designated as one or the other and then aggregated up to the state level analysis. Now, before I go any further, I will certainly admit that this definition too has its limitations, and I think we learned that through the process. And we can talk about it as I continue to go forward with the results. But even this designation of urban and rural really misses some of the vital connections and interdependencies between urban and rural communities as well. So I think when we get to the conclusion of this presentation, it would be interesting to have a conversation with you all and to hear maybe from David as well in terms of how do we rethink urban and rural that has a stronger focus on access and access and interconnectedness of a place versus strictly their designation as urban and rural, which I think would be critical in terms of truly understanding economic opportunity. So when we apply these definitions across the country, again, we're looking at state by state. We use county level data and aggregate up to the state. We look at urban and rural population divide. So when we apply this definition to population, we see that only 4 states across the country have greater rural versus urban populations. Again, this confirms what we know about urban areas as population centers, but of course, this does not account for the vast number of states in which land area is primarily rural. Just want to note too, using this slide, that throughout the presentation, you will see varying shades of green and purple on the map. For each of the measures I will discuss, we calculate the difference between urban and rural areas on each measure. If a state is shaded green, it means that rural areas have a stronger outcome on that measure than urban areas do. If it's purple, it means that urban areas have a stronger outcome. The darker the shade, the more pronounced the divergence in outcomes between urban and rural areas. So if it's a fainter color, that indicates that there is a narrower divide between urban and rural areas on particular outcomes. Turning to broadband access, which of course is critically important to economic activity. Again, our analysis confirms what we know about the urban and rural divide, that in all states across the country, broadband access is higher in urban areas than in rural areas. And we see, you'll notice on this map too, and you'll notice going forward that there There are some states that have the dots, and those are the states that have higher than average, in this case, state broadband access rates. Urban and rural education divide. Again, similarly with education, urban attainment tends to be higher in states. Urban attainment tends to be higher than rural in states throughout the country. You'll notice there are places like Utah and Vermont, for example, that have higher rural attainment than urban. And generally speaking, we see this in those states that have a high density of rural universities. And we know also that education follows broadband and is very closely related, where lack of broadband access inhibits educational opportunities, particularly for rural residents. So most of what I just talked about in terms of population and broadband access and education, those are areas where the urban-rural divide conversation has centered in large part on the economic activity of regions and of states. What we lack in the current conversation is looking at actual economic characteristics in terms of business growth and contributions to state GDP. So that's what I'm going to do right now. So looking at the urban-rural divide in terms of high-value business growth. So what this is measuring is the growth from 2010 to 2015, so looking at post-recession recovery, in terms of the number of businesses in traded sectors or the number of businesses that export outside of the region. We call these businesses high value in that, of course, they bring new money into the area and help connect the area with regional, state, and global economies. High value businesses, of course, also tend to pay higher wages. So it's very important that we hone in on these businesses. We know overall and generally speaking that we've been seeing upticks in rural entrepreneurship, and that is somewhat reflected here. This analysis goes, and this measure, particularly in terms of high value business growth, goes the next level to really account for not only entrepreneurship and new businesses, but new businesses that are in the traded sector. Interestingly, rural areas in 15 states in our analysis have stronger high-value business growth than urban areas. So that came as quite a surprise to us to see that rural areas in many states across the country are leading their states in terms of high-value business growth. You'll notice, for example, in California with a lightly shaded green, attributed largely to agricultural production and exports, and David will talk more about that. We see similar in Idaho, for example, and in other states across the country. Prosperity growth. This is another interesting factor. Growth from 2010 to 2015, we're looking at the areas between rural, the difference between urban and rural areas in terms of their contributions to state GDP. So surprisingly, rural areas in 25 out of 45 states have stronger contributions to state GDP than urban areas of the state. I'll let that sink in a little bit, let you take a look at the map there. You'll see, for example, North Dakota, which was a surprise to me, which obviously is a highly rural state. What we know about North Dakota is coming up here as having much higher urban growth than rural growth. This again demonstrates the strong interconnectedness between rural and urban areas, particularly in terms of their economies. We know that fracking in North Dakota is happening, is driving a lot of the economic growth that's happening in North Dakota. Obviously, it's natural resource extraction, happening primarily in rural parts of the state. But that industry that's generating the economic activity, which is stemming from rural communities, is responsible for job growth in urban communities related to finance and legal and other services that are attached to that industry. So again, a strong urban-rural economic interconnection. Turning to bridging the divide. So our analysis, which focuses not only on some of those sort of core areas where we see urban and rural areas sort of compared to each other for economic purposes, whether it's population, education, and broadband access, all critical pieces, but also adding in the components of high-value business growth and prosperity growth. really helps us give a context to and test traditional narratives about the urban-rural divide. We know that challenges exist for rural communities, but not uniformly throughout the country. Strengths and opportunities are also widespread, as indicated by the significant role of rural economies to the growth of urban areas in many states throughout the country. These findings signal that other critical factors beyond a strict urban-rural divide are at play, and indeed sustainable growth hinges less on a place's designation as urban or rural and more on its economic connections. In the report, we outline a few strategies that have been emerging in regions across the country, namely rural linkages to urban clusters. We're seeing this happening in Virginia. There's a state initiative called Go Virginia that is funding regions throughout the state, particularly in their efforts to collaborate between urban and rural parts of the state. What we're seeing in the southern part of the state is that an analysis has been conducted to examine what are the assets of the rural areas that can help connect them with the economic activity that's happening in the urban core. And oftentimes this will be a supplier relationship. So we're anxiously looking at how that develops, particularly here in Virginia. Looking at urban linkages to rural clusters, again, thinking about agriculture, thinking about natural resource extraction in North Dakota. I think this is really sort of flipping on its head that that not only can rural areas generate economic growth by tapping urban clusters, but quite often it's the other way around as well. And I think we'll hear more about that from David. And then, of course, rural entrepreneurship in urban markets. There have been a number of studies conducted recently showing the very high growth of entrepreneurship in rural communities. Often, this is attributed to not only the capacity of rural entrepreneurs and the dedication of rural entrepreneurs to making a business for themselves. And a lot of that actually is farming, but of course that expands to many other areas as well. But also in many places across the country, rural areas do have, there is a lack of opportunity, particularly when there's a lack of access to particular assets. So we're seeing rural entrepreneurship strengthen throughout the country. We're seeing not only rural entrepreneurs tapping urban markets as consumers of products, but also as testers for those products, so that rural entrepreneurs can utilize urban markets to refine their products and then scale up to a global market and to really bring economic growth to the community that would not otherwise be possible. So that's sort of a nuanced relationship between urban and rural that I think can be explored a little bit more. So with that, I just want to conclude by saying that our analysis was eye-opening, and it really led us to be strongly passionate about the fact that it's time to shift the narrative from urban versus rural to a shared economic future, and to think about what are the solutions that will help bolster the relationship between urban and rural areas, again, to the benefit not only of those individual places, not only to the regions in which they reside, but also to states on the whole. So with that, I will turn it over to David. Here's my contact information. I also added a link to the report to the chat function. So if you're interested in accessing the report, please feel free to do that. And with that, I will turn it over. Thank you.
All right, how's that?
It's good.
Okay, so thanks for the invitation to speak today, and I'll try to do a quick flyover here. I have a bunch of slides, but I'll go through them quickly to talk about the Rural-Urban Connection strategy, or RUCS, that we're doing here in the SACOG region, which is the lower part of the Sacramento Valley. So we're kind of right in the middle of California, and we're in the heart of the farmland here. I wanted to sit on the slide for just a minute to kind of talk about that tagline that's there: enhancing rural economic viability and environmental sustainability. The reason that's important is because that's really what this project is about. We are starting off with understanding what are the economic contributions to this region from the rural parts of our region. And then once we understand that and we are able to find ways for farmers and processors and distributors to make more money from agriculture, we believe that that's basically a de facto land use conservation policy or de facto urban boundary, depending on how you want to look at it. And then we get the environmental function of the ecosystem services from that landscape, so that the two go hand in hand. And I'm not going to talk a lot today about the ecosystem services, although there is a big market play in those services, and figuring out those values is really important. But I'm going to focus mainly on planning and economic development in rural areas and how that syncs up with regional objectives and links to the urban parts of our region. So starting off with kind of a planning perspective, this has been the regional planning perspective ever since there's been regional planning, which is basically looking at a collection of urban areas and calling that regional planning. The problem is that, the planning follows the population. So 85% of our population here is urban, 15% rural, but the land area is flipped. And I think this is true kind of generally nationally, that's how population and land area break down. So if we're talking about land use planning, but we're only looking at 15% of the region, we're really missing, a big chunk of what's important out there. And if we're going to call ourselves a regional planning organization, we need to look at both. So what we did is we brought in the urban or the rural parts of our region, added a lot of detail to that map that you see there on the left, where what does rural mean? I mean, green could mean anything to anyone, whether it's open space or agriculture or future urban. And so if you're going to do planning, you need to have some guidance on what's happening on the ground or what might happen in the future. And so we added a lot of detail to that at a parcel level to understand what's going on in the rural parts of our region and how do we then plan for that? So we also had to take stock of what are our opportunities and what are our challenges in these rural economies. So we have two big markets that we play in, mainly the export market. 98% of what we grow here is exported out of this region. And there's a lot of jobs that go with that, but we also have local and regional market opportunities that are really profitable and in high demand. And so what we're trying to understand is how do we play both games here? And so, let's take stock of what we have. We are in the Central Valley of California. We have great soil, great climate. At least in the northern part of the valley, we still have water. And we have access to a lot of markets. We're at the confluence of 4 highways, rail. We have a port here. So we can get product out to market rather quickly. We see rising demand not only within our own region or mega region, which includes the San Francisco Bay Area, but across the world. And the real money in the food and ag game is really in adding value to products. And we have some of that. We'd like to get more. Here's the challenge, lack of infrastructure. So I just mentioned value add. We've been actually losing our value add capacity in this region for the last 40 to 50 years. It's been consolidating in other parts of the state or outside of the state, and just hasn't been as profitable as it has been in the past, so people have decided to close shop. Water and labor supply are going to be challenges going forward. They already are today, and it's not going to get any better. We know that. The regulatory environment can help, but oftentimes it kind of hurts, and we need to understand what we need to go after in terms of regulatory reform, and having plans and strategies helps us advocate for specific things that we'd like to see changed. And then obviously growth pressure. We're in California. There's still a lot of people coming here, and that growth pressure is pushing out onto our agricultural lands, and so we have to find ways to balance that. At the end of the day, what we're really trying to do is position our region for investment. We want people to see this as a place to do business in the food and ag space, and we want to attract that investment here. And the way you do that is you lay out plans. You say, this is where we're going to go. This is how we're going to do it. These are the incentives that we're going to be offering, and that's how we leverage our natural assets and our place here in the state to attract that investment. The project, we had to break this down into topic areas because it's very complicated. So we are looking at the land use and conservation plans and strategies that are on the books today or would be helpful for us in the future. We're looking at the infrastructure for agriculture. And again, that's that processing capacity. It's also the roads, but it's the people, it's the, the canals that deliver water. It's basically any form of infrastructure that is an input to production or supports the industry is something that we're looking at in this topic area. Market opportunities. So obviously we need to know if we're going to try to position ourselves, we need to position ourselves to take advantage of new markets. And so we are constantly looking around to see what are the market changes and how can our farmers and processors be positioned to go after those changes. Forest management, about almost 30% of our region is forested. So this is a topic area in and of itself. I won't go into detail here other than suffice it to say our forests are basically burning up and drying out. And so we need to figure out how to manage that because this is where our water comes from. 60% of the water in a wet year comes from the Sierra Nevadas and the snowpack, and yet that's going away. So we need to figure out how to manage that resource, and a lot of that has to do with how we manage trees and when we cut them and fires and things like that. Finally, regulations, again, this is the thread that runs through everything, and are those regulations helping or hurting? And we can understand that better when we have plans and strategies that we're trying to implement and put those against where the regulations are. And then to be really effective, we developed a toolkit. That toolkit is based off of that map that I showed you earlier. Behind this crop map is a lot of data that tells us whether farmers can do well or not at growing crops. We use that then to start thinking about what are scenarios for the future? How do we plan for changes in those cropping patterns, whether they're changes that are coming our way because of things that we haven't done or changes that we want to initiate to go after market opportunities. And so we have to look at those markets. We're looking at the international markets as well as the local and regional markets and saying, okay, so here's a set of market conditions, whether, again, they're ones that we're trying to create or that we just know we're facing. And then we start to run scenarios. And when we run those scenarios, we get a set of results. Here are some basic indicators that we look at. So return on investment to the farmer, how much water do we need to grow that set of crops? How many trucks are we putting on the road to move those crops to market? How much labor do we need to grow those crops and harvest them? So that's a basic idea of the toolkit. And then we're starting to link that to the ecosystem services. So what's the carbon cycle and are we affecting a lot of carbon release or sequestration? We're looking at effects on habitat, and then we're looking at effects on groundwater recharge. That's a big deal in California right now, is how do we start recharging our aquifers since we're losing our snowpack? We got to store that water somewhere else. And we have very large cavities sitting under the Central Valley that have been drained for quite a while, and we're trying to figure out how to refill them so we have water supply going forward. And then we have to look at what's the economic impact. So right now we're doing mostly this. So for every dollar that you spend, the farmer gets 15 to 16 cents, and that's most of what we're doing. But the real value is in the rest of the supply chain. So there's another 45 cents in aggregation, processing, and distribution. We need to do more of that. So, one of the things that we're really trying to understand is how do we, again, attract that here in this region and leverage our ability to produce that food, but then also get it into the supply chain with more value in it when it leaves this region or goes into market within this region. And then there's the multiplier effect, and I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. We also have to dispel this notion that this is what local and regional markets look like. Yes, farmers markets are very important, and they're a really kind of important marketing way to market our local products, but really the action is in larger scale consumers, grocery stores. Blue Apron just opened a facility to the west of us that I estimated the size of that facility will probably drive about 14,000 acres of production into that facility if they source locally. We have actually large scale aggregators that move crops like, say, apples into local markets at a very large volume. There's a place down in Stockton that's just south of us that is supplying all the McDonald's in Northern California with a local product. And then finally, freezing and drying are where we get shelf stability and our ability to then feed this region and beyond year-round with locally grown products. When we talk about local and regional markets, I really am trying to move away from farmers markets, because they're just one part of this, and they're actually less than 1% of total consumption, and move into these institutions and large-scale buyers that can get their product from local growers here. So we have to understand the economics of that, and we looked at this notion of food hubs. And in our region, we're looking at these as both aggregation and processing sites. And so it's not, again, not in this kind of, farmers market, local food system play that most people think about. We're thinking larger scale, but again, regional. We had an engineer actually come out and design a facility for us, a prototypical facility, so we know what it costs, we know what it takes to operate that, we know what kind of specs we need to then land 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of these in our region, if not more. And then we ran the economics, and we said, okay, well, how does this thing, first we're going to phase it up. So we're going to start with simple aggregation distribution, then we're going to go into fresh cut, which is just cutting the product and throwing it in a box. Then we're going to start drying, then we're going to start freezing. And as we move along this phasing, how do we do? So we actually start making money in year 5. It's positive cash flow in year 5. By year 7, we're having internal rate of return that goes positive. We calculated how many acres we need to underpin or to support this facility. And then we also calculated how many people we'd be feeding 25% of their diet of the products that run through this facility. Long story short, this thing works. And we have tortured these numbers, and we still find that they work pretty well. And this is actually conservative. This is using wholesale prices, not retail prices. And this is serving mainly institutions, not direct to retailer. We then have to see, okay, well, do we have the land to actually support that? And we have to do calculations about if we're going to start supporting local and regional markets, how much land does it take to do that? So we have, this is just really quick and dirty, but this is, calculations of how much land we need to hit certain targets for locally grown product. So now, again, we're getting back into the land use planning and what does that mean? And now we're back to the economics. Okay, so once we understand how this system works, what it takes to make this system work, and I want to also emphasize that I'm talking about this in the context of local and regional markets, but these products, especially the shelf-stable ones, can be easily exported, and that's our long-term game. Kind of incubate these ideas on ourselves here in this region, and then turn it into export of higher valued product. But how does this now ripple through our economy? So this is the specialty crop cluster. Specialty crops are fruits, nuts, and vegetables. They're the highest value set of crops that are out there. And here's the cluster, again, production, aggregation, processing, distribution, and then there's support services that go around that. But that's the main cluster that we're talking about. Here's how it compares in terms of the multiplier effect to other industries in our region. It's really competitive. So again, these are things that I think people have been taking for granted and not really understanding well. We're trying to get people to understand there is a major game here that we can play way better if we kind of put our mind to it and start making our investments in how to support these industries and turn it into a much larger marketplace than we're playing in right now. And we're playing in a pretty big marketplace, but we can do better. And here's why this is important, because guess what? Most of the jobs are actually urban jobs at a rate of 2 to 1. So you can see where those jobs are clustered. They're clustered in downtown Sacramento, out in the city of Woodland, which is out here to the west. You go up to the north, the city of Yuba City. These are high concentrations of jobs in food and ag, and they're urban jobs. So at a rate of 2 to 1, we have a lot of jobs in this region underpinned by an industry that's mostly rural. And you can see the values there as well, a 4 to 1 ratio in terms of the economic value in this region. And again, I want to emphasize, this is just specialty crops. I'm not talking about livestock, hay, grain, and dairy. So this is just part of the industry. Now we have, a real rural-urban connection here. Let me talk a little bit more about the rural-urban connection, kind of a darker side of that, which is what are the impacts when we start to use our land in different ways. So we did an analysis of converting agricultural land to urban uses. You can see those conversion rates. I don't have to read them to you, but we looked at different growth patterns, basically drops in density, so increases in land consumption. We looked at what's happening today with the crops being grown in this particular county that we were studying. And then we looked at what happens if they start growing more specialty crops, which they can do, they're just not doing right now. And you can see those drops in value, they go up pretty substantially. And then we looked at what does it cost to actually grow those communities instead of growing crops? And it's expensive. So you're adding anywhere from $1.2 billion of infrastructure costs, all the way up to double that. And then the kicker is, over the long term, what happens under these growth patterns? There are growth patterns that we analyze that actually can create revenue for these jurisdictions, down to those that actually, bleed out revenue because the densities are so low and yet the service area is really high. So this is a way for us to start having a balanced conversation about what we're doing with our land use, to start thinking more strategically about urban and rural growth. And what does it mean for this region? More importantly, right now in California is air quality. We are subject to a cap and trade program, and there's another one coming. Legislature here last year just passed another cap and trade program. So we have a lot of industries and the state working really hard to reduce emissions. We found that, and I'll just say it, I won't go through the details here, but we found that when processing leaves this region and we put products basically in these trucks and send it off to the next best facility, we see major increases in emissions to the extent that we are actually, even though we close those processing facilities here and those emissions go away from those processing facilities, we see net gains in emissions. And this is an example of actually kind of a dirty processing facility going away. There are plenty of clean processing facilities that could go away too, and those net increase in emissions would be a lot bigger than what I'm showing here. But the short story is, processing close to production actually helps with reducing emissions related to the food and ag industry. This is also a great finding. This is the American Farmland Trust that studied agriculture in California, along with a professor at UC Davis. They found that urbanization is anywhere from 58 to 70 times the greenhouse gas emissions that agricultural land produces. So, we have a pretty strong and compelling argument why we should really be thinking about urban growth in the context of rural economies, not only for economic development and job growth, but also for the environmental impacts. I'll end here by just saying that, here at SACOG and our member jurisdictions, we are thinking really hard about this. So when we look in the rear view mirror, we were consuming 333 acres for every 1,000 people we were adding to this region. Because we are thinking about this and working really hard with our jurisdictions to think about different growth patterns, and because the market for housing has changed, we're down to 42 acres for every 1,000 people. So, again, rural-urban connection. Urban policies and strategies they are important. They do have an impact on the rural landscape, and then that rural landscape has an impact on what job creation we can gain from these rural industries that really bridge rural and urban. So I will stop there, and I guess we're in Q&A period here.
Thank you, David and Christy. We have about 15 minutes for questions. If you would like to ask a question, please go to your questions drop down on your toolbar and type it in that way, and I'll look out for questions.
All right, so while we're waiting for questions, Neil actually sent me a note to explain sort of where in the process the Farm Bill is at the moment. And unfortunately, I don't have a lot of updates because it's still being written. There's been a lot more progress in the House Agricultural Committee rather than the Senate. I think the Senate is sort of waiting to see what the House is going to release before they do as well. The latest news that I've heard is that the bill should be wrapping up early April over the recess and through the first part of April, and it should be released mid to late April for markup in the House. And we should see a Senate bill follow up soon after that. But a lot of the holdup that's been delaying this process, we originally expected the bill to be out in February, but there's been a lot of disagreement over SNAP. As you can imagine, this is what held up the bill back in 2014. There were a lot of disagreements about how much money should be contributed to SNAP as far as mandatory funds, and whether or not there should be increased, regulation on the people that are eligible for SNAP. So again, that has come up. So actually on the House side, the Democrats have stopped negotiating with the Republicans because they have yet to see a draft of the bill yet. It's being drafted just by the Republicans, and they wanted to see a draft of the bill in order to continue negotiations. But unfortunately, it seems like the chairman of the Agricultural House Committee has continued to push forward because he'd really like to see this bill go through. And so we will hopefully see a bill in April. Unfortunately, it comes at the cost of perhaps seeing SNAP get significantly cut. The last farm bill, it was cut by, I believe it was 90 million annually. So I am a little pessimistic about what the cuts will be this time. And of course, there have been talks about putting more employment requirements on people who are on SNAP, maybe changing the way that food stamps work to perhaps giving them like a blue apron version of food through the SNAP program. So we are keeping a close eye on what happens, and we will let you know as soon as we see any sort of draft.
Thanks very much. Cameron, oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say we do have one question. Christy, we had a question. What was the source of the broadband data from your presentation?
Thank you, Cameron. Yeah, that's a good point. It's the FCC. And all of the data sources are available in the report itself. I provided that link in the chat function, so please feel free to refer to that. But it is the 2016 data from the FCC.
Great, thank you. Neil, did you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, I've got a question that was forwarded to me. Can you give us any examples, Christy, of the rural entrepreneurship that's tapping into urban markets?
Sure, yeah, great question. Well, we know that I think I've gotten the question several times. It's focused on, well, any economic development strategy, whether it's urban or rural, really should be focused on developing local assets and building from within. And we know, in terms of sound economic practice, that certainly is true. We want communities to be able to build on their assets from within. Given the role of new companies as job and innovation creators, entrepreneurship obviously offers rural communities an exciting opportunity for this growth from within strategy. So we were excited to learn about a couple of examples throughout the country of places that really are taking the strategy to heart, taking the growth from within strategy to heart, but also being able to utilize the economic relationship with urban areas in ways that benefit both. So we know that rural entrepreneurship, again, as I mentioned previously, is expanding throughout the country. But we know also that thinking about rural entrepreneurship beyond traditional entrepreneurship and ways that there are linkages with urban and global markets is critical if these new entrepreneurs, if these businesses are to transform their local economies. So in addition to the value chain relationships, we're seeing, again, as I mentioned, opportunities for rural entrepreneurs to utilize urban markets to really help hone in on their niche products. So we know, for example, rural hops growers in Oregon rely on the sophisticated tastes of folks, particularly in the Portland area, to provide feedback to them, and they have different ways of sort of measuring that in terms of measuring those tastes from craft beer consumers in the city of Portland. But as you know, as farmers and hops growers in particular in Oregon get a sense of this information from what is happening in urban parts of the state, they're not only obviously selling their product and then being processed for craft beer, but given that Oregon and Portland in particular is sort of ahead of the curve in terms of the global market for craft beer, this really situates rural areas and rural entrepreneurs in particular in Oregon to be able to export globally, given that they're able to refine their product and have the best product. So it's the power of export promotion for rural entrepreneurs. We know that that then on the flip side of that, having that export support for rural entrepreneurs is critically important to make those economic linkages throughout the world for their products. And that, of course, you know, depending on the type of entrepreneur that it is, but I think at this point, everyone is in agreement that broadband access in particular is a basic foundation of any economy. And that's particularly important when you're talking about entrepreneurship. So export support for entrepreneurship, particularly in rural communities, as well as broadband access, are two critical ingredients to ensuring that rural areas have a strong and bolstered entrepreneurship community.
Thank you, Christy. So there's just a follow-up to your first question about the broadband data source. Is there any other way we can measure broadband data, since broadband data is self-reported by the ISPs? In rural Colorado, the data is exceptionally questionable and known to be incorrect as compared to real life.
I would love to work with the person who asked the question. If they have other ideas about how to do that, we certainly would be open to it. I think the goal here really is to be able to capture the information in a way that reflects the realities on the ground. So in our attempts to include things like high value business growth and prosperity, we felt like we were expanding the definition of what urban and rural is, and to really be able to see those contributions for what they are, as opposed to the urban versus rural, which is very isolating and conjures up some specific images about what the economic opportunities are in each place. Again, not only broadening the definition of urban and rural, but even drilling down to specific measures like broadband access is critically important. So, so I would be happy to work with the person who asked the question, or if there are others on the line that have alternative data sources. I think, you know, most folks rely on FCC for this type of data and information. But if there are reasons to question it, we definitely would be willing to re-examine it.
Thank you, Christy. We'll make sure to put you in touch with the person who asked that question.
Great, thank you.
Are there any other questions? I'll give it a minute.
Well,
So it doesn't look like we have any more questions. Neil, I'll just turn it back over to you to wrap up.
Thank you very much, Cameron, and thanks for handling this portion of the webinar. I just want to personally thank both Christy and David for what I thought were excellent and very informative presentations. As I noted, the webinar is being recorded. There was an awful lot of information in many of those graphics, and so the webinar will be available to you so that you can revisit some of those graphics. And certainly, as you see in this last slide, you have the contact information for both Christy and David, and I know that each of them would be delighted to provide you with any additional information or help that they can. So feel free to reach out to them. Feel free to reach out to me, neil@narc.org. If you've got comments about this webinar, we are really trying to improve and upgrade and the quality of our webinars. And we would really like to hear from you as to whether this was useful. We'd also love to hear from you about topics that you would be particularly interested in. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Please feel free to reach out to Macy for more information about the Farm Bill. Macy will certainly provide you with whatever she has, and I can assure you that Macy will be putting whatever information she has into any upcoming editions of eRegions. So be sure to take a look there and see, and if we've got any special alerts that we need to get out to you, we will be sure to do that. Again, thank you, Christy and David, very, very much. Thank you, Cameron, for pulling us all together on this. Not exactly easy. Again, we look forward to hearing from you, either for more information as a result of the webinar or for any kinds of suggestions, ideas you may have with respect to webinars as we go forward. I will tell you that there is a webinar coming up. We're finalizing the date. It will be in early May. That webinar will deal with health and the built environment. For those of you who were at the recent meeting here in Washington, you'll know that that was part of the conference. We thought the session went so well and got such positive feedback that we thought it would be useful to go ahead and sort of repeat it. We'll do it a little differently, but sort of repeat it. We'll be getting information out about that very shortly as soon as we have the final date. But we know it will be the first week in May. With that, I will sign off and say again, thank you all very much. And that's it, and have a great rest of the day and week.